I'm Kumar Ramakrishna, Associate Dean, RSIS, and Head of ICPVTR. Welcome to this first installment of our webinar series on Southeast Asia's terrorism terrain, 2 decades after Bali, changes, continuities, and trajectories, with our two special guests, Associate Professor Bilveer Singh and Mr. Rakyan Adibrata. Let me give you some context for this series. On 12 October 2002, the Bali bombings rocked Southeast Asia, taking 202 lives in what is considered the deadliest attack in the region still after so many years. The attacks elevated the threat of Islamist terrorism and played a major role in shaping counterterrorism efforts in the region. 20 years on, two transnational threat groups, Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, continue to define the terrorist threat in Southeast Asia, while at the same time, local militant groups demonstrate a tenacious ability to adapt amidst a changing operational environment. In light of the 20th anniversary of the 2002 Bali bombings, ICPVTR is running a 3-part series of webinars to assess the changes, continuities, and trajectories of the terror threat in Southeast Asia. For this first webinar in the series, we will be closely examining the network behind the 2002 Bali bombings, not to mention numerous other attacks and plots, Jamaat Islamiyah or JI. JI has been the target of sustained waves of arrests and leadership decapitations in recent years, degrading the group's operational effectiveness, and yet JI still remains a threat, albeit a rather lower profile one nowadays. In that light, our speakers this morning will sketch out the varying levels of threat JI has posed to the region over the past 2 decades, while at the same time also addressing how the terrorism terrain in Southeast Asia has been impacted with the rise of IS, as well as the similarities and differences between JI and IS in terms of ideology, ambitions, and modalities. So let me briefly introduce our two speakers. We are very honored this morning to have with us two experts. Associate Professor Bilveer Singh is presently the Deputy Head of the Department of Political Science in NUS. He is concurrently an adjunct senior fellow at the Center of Excellence for National Security within RSIS. Professor Bilveer specializes in international relations and comparative politics and has taught at NUS for 40 years. He is one of Singapore's and the region's leading security and terrorism specialists, particularly on Islamist extremism. We are very happy to have Prof. Bilveer with us this morning. Also with us, we have Mr. Pak Rakyan Adibrata. Pak Rakyan worked as an expert advisor at the Indonesian House of Representatives, specializing in homeland security from 2010 until 2019. He was involved in the deliberations leading to key counter-terrorist legislation, such as the 2013 Counter-Financing Terrorism and the 2018 Anti-Terrorism legislation. Pak Rakyan was appointed as Country Director for the International Association for Counterterrorism and Security Professionals, Indonesia, in 2018, and is also the Country Representative for Indonesia for the Nordic Counterterrorism Center based in Helsinki. He is also currently serving as Deputy Secretary of the Bureau for Prevention of Extremism and Terrorism in the Indonesian Council of Ulama, or MUI, M-U-I. Each speaker this morning will have about 20 minutes or so to share their views. After that, I will moderate the question and answer session. As per the usual practice, please send in your questions in the Zoom chat where I and the speakers can see them. I will then guide the discussion accordingly. With that, I will now pass the time to our first speaker, Professor Bilveer Singh. Over to you, Prof. Bilveer.
Yeah, good morning, and Pak Kumar, Prof. Kumar, thank you very much. First and foremost, kudos to you and your team for organizing this very important, timely, and very meaningful webinar. For me personally, I'm equally honored to be sharing the panel with one of probably the leading expert on JI today, as well as a top security specialist on Indonesia, Pak Rakyan Adibrata. If you get to know Pak Rakyan, I think you realize what I'm talking about. I'm very impressed with what has been done by RSIS, in particular ICPVTR, and in fact this is one more block and layer of what has been done in this area, in particular under the leadership of Prof. Kumar, a guy whom I greatly respect. Now, in the interest of time, let me kick off the discussion and the presentation. I will provide a very broad overview of a number of things which I've been asked to speak on. I will also dabble a little bit into the past. The whole idea is let's hear from people who are actually joining us. The reason being, look, 20 years after the fact, it's very important, as Prof. Kumar said, the security terrain and landscape have actually altered fundamentally. The players have changed, yet the quality, nature, and the profoundness of the threat actually remain. In fact, for me, it has worsened. It has worsened. If you understand the strategic approach of Islamists, they continue to be very clear about where they want to go. And just because there are no bombs, especially in Indonesia, mainly from JI, it does not mean this group is on the downslide. This is called IDAT. It's part and parcel of a calculated move. And so much so that the rise of the Islamic State and, in fact, COVID-19 gave this particular group all the time, money, space, organization to be what they are today, probably the most dangerous extremist terrorist group in Indonesia. And if we start to connect it with some other developments, which I'll talk about, then you realize that 20 years after Bali is not simply about having the Imam Samudras and the Hambalis blowing up infrastructures and soft targets. Is much more. Hopefully that will be the message I want to deliver at the end of my presentation. So let me kick off, and please bear with me. I think it's okay. Let's see. I hope you guys can see my slides. So I've been asked to talk about continuity, change, and trajectory. And I think, let me start with, maybe it's a motherhood statement, but I think it's much more than that. Let's not forget what actually happened in this part of the world 20 years or just before 20 years ago. But even more important, it is not just an issue of trying to drill down what the bombing faction, mind you, I underline this, the bombing faction of JI under the leadership of Hambali and CS or gang did, but the implication of following it. Okay, it is JI cannot be directly equated to just the bombing faction. There is also a very powerful Dakwah faction, something which we can talk about. But lest we forget what happened, and this is clearly evident from what they have done. So to me, understanding the terrain today does not start on 12th October 2022, in 2 weeks' time. I think what has happened since the first Bali bombing is equally significant because of the nature of the muddiness of the terrain, in particular in Indonesia. So we all are familiar with the major bombings, in Indonesia done by JI groups and later on joined by IS. Both are lethal. JI remains very, very dominant and powerful. IS is somewhat of the downslide, but the game is not over for them. They're still around. The Philippines have been equally significant. Continuous bombing, mainly because the security terrain is far more complex. The most important group, the MILF, actually has reached some kind of a modus vivendi with the government. But because of that, they are split. And these splits are, in fact, equally lethal, as we can talk about later. But let's not forget that there are other parts of the region where you are seeing things. Thailand is one, especially southern Thailand. Look at the number of deaths from 2004 to this year. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, the numbers are quite huge. And then the threat continues. On the right side, sometimes something which we do not talk much about, but I'm very heartened that ICPVTR actually is monitoring this very closely. Look at the number of groups involved. I've not been able to get a specific casualty numbers, but the amazing number of groups operating in Myanmar, on the border of Myanmar, and actually beyond. The diaspora is actually very potent and something which can be capitalized and energized for something very frightening. And many countries in the region are actually playing host to them. So this is one dimension which we should not forget. Some pictures, infographic about who these guys are. Look at the weapon systems they have. God knows from where they have got it. Maybe while watching terrorist financing is important, I think watching the weapon flow is equally significant for the agencies involved in monitoring this group. So my point about this is, while we are prepared to fight the last war, since Bali, in fact, before Bali, don't forget that these groups are also dreaming big. We should also be prepared for the next war. And the next war may not be a shooting war, may not necessarily be a shooting war. It may go together, shooting and non-shooting. But I think this is something we should not go to sleep with. We should be very mindful. I can talk about what happened in 2019 in Indonesia, about the deal made by one of the presidential candidates with the major Islamist group. I mean, fortunately, that particular candidate did not come to power. But this is the modus operandi of this group. Just because we are not winning through bombing, every other avenue actually is open for them for operation. So that's one of the things I want to talk about. So one, yes, we are talking about terrorism and the continuous threat of extremism. The attacks have continued since 2002. This is a motherhood statement, but mainly by IS group after 2009. Because in 2010, the JI leaders made a deal, no more bombing until such time we are ready for them. So I think this has been reiterated by the continued existence of people like Abu Bakar Bashir, Abu Rushdan, and even Paravijanto, which Pak Rakyan can talk about. Number two, the point I'd like to make is, I think Kumar alluded to it, the terrain has become much more complex and complicated, that in order to understand the threat, Al-Qaeda is dangerous and important and even becoming more powerful. Taking out Osama and Zawahiri is actually meaningless because they operate very differently. But its offshoot, the Islamic State, is equally potent. Fortunately, in the region, after Marawi, there was a downside, but it still remained. It undertook a major security operation where in terms of casualties, it was almost 6 times more than Bali, 1,200. So these are groups which we should be mindful about. They are competing, and that competition is not good for ordinary citizens, policymakers, and counterterrorism agencies. At the same time, new groups have sprouted. The JAD, the BIFF, ARSA, and probably there are even factions within them. Something worth noting. But my final point is, after Bali, the Abu Sayyaf and MILF remains very powerful in Philippines. MILF have signed a deal. It's not a perfect deal, but better than nothing. And in the case of Indonesia, the Jemaah Islamiyah is the single most potent group on the scene. If you are looking at continuity, one of the things I've been asked to talk about, while we talk a lot about the Islamist group, let's not forget the non-Islamist group, which also exists in this part of the world, in Philippines, in Indonesia, and in Myanmar. Number two, the role of the two leading transnational, international terrorist organizations, which provide the vectors for groups here in one form or another. And the point worth belaboring, the continued importance of the Middle East for Southeast Asia, for ideas and actions of this kind. This is one of the continuities for the last 200 years. Right? Number three, the growing sophistication of these groups, extremists, terrorist groups, and their ability to weaponize all these things, social media, new weapons, platforms, women families, and so on and so forth, because they are so clear about where they want to go, and any means is possible. But fortunately, on the other side, the groups, the governments, the agencies countering them are equally sophisticated. Are we ahead of them or not? I think is a moot point, something which we can continue to debate about. But fortunately, more resources in terms of mankind, people, money, technology has been pumped into it. And at the same time, the benefit of international collaboration and intelligence sharing have actually been very, very beneficial in terms of dealing with this particular group. Change. Terrorists are the best learning organizations. I'll repeat that later on one more time. Because the moment you hit them, they learn from that and they adjust. So they are, I think this is Kumar's specialty. They actually operate a la communist parties and communist groups. The same way. They operate in the same way. So now decentralization, growing autonomy of terrorist groups and cells have made it very difficult to actually deal with them. You don't even know sometimes who these guys are. Okay, and this is going to be one of the great challenges in the next couple of years. Number two, the splitting. In fact, this is linked to the second last point, the splitting up and breakup of terrorist groups due to a whole host of reasons. I mean, just look at how Abu Bakr Bashir was in one particular group and where it has landed up. The same with his son, Rohim. So I think this is one thing which is happening. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, again, we can debate. The continued discussion and debate about the importance of the near and far enemy remains. And this is one thing which I think agencies dealing with this kind of threat must drill and understand and appreciate. The point being, eventually, the terrain between national, regional, and international may get blurred. And therefore, how do we deal with it? Whatever happens in Palestine, in Israel, whatever happens in Afghanistan, whatever is happening in other parts of the world, like even Ukraine, can and will have implications for this part of the world. Fortunately, what has changed is, as I mentioned earlier, the ability of the state to deal through soft and hard measures and all other avenues with this threat, because a threat anywhere is a threat everywhere. And no one state can take care of the terrorist threat because of the nature of the threat which exists today in terms of ideology, financing, and so on and so forth. While there have been good things to talk about in terms of the degradation, cutting down of leaders and members of terrorist organizations and individuals, and I think Indonesia is a classic case with more than 200 being killed, more than 1,700 being behind bars, but it have not ended the threat. So while I'll refer to this as crippling, not the ending. At the same time, because of this crippling and ending, groups have surfaced because of the differences in terms of ideas and ideologies. Finally, I think in terms of change, COVID played an important role in terms of consolidation of the terrorist groups, extremist group. The rise of Taliban, I think, is very significant. All those who argue that it is insignificant, I think, are barking on the wrong tree. I think Taliban is significant and it will have implications for Southeast Asia. In particular, the former GI, which had linkages in Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia. Okay, because their footprints are there in Karachi, in Peshawar, in Kandahar, and so on and so forth. So how do we manage this is something I think agencies need to be careful about. But more important, in my next 6-7 minutes, is to share what I think is the future. I think the ball game has changed and is changing very fast. As I said, the terrorists are some of the best learning organizations and actors. Their ability to transform and to innovate and to renovate is amazing. If you continue to fight the old battles, I think you're going to end up as a cropper. Okay, the ability of these groups to shift from bullets to ballots, as in Algeria, as in Egypt, I think is something that should be noted. And leading ideologues like Musab al-Suri have been pushing for this for the last 20 years. The last 20 years, they've been talking about how this kind of individuals and group, they are convinced that they are on the right path. They are convinced that Allah is on their side, whatever it is. I mean, it is for them to argue. But the ability to innovate and change, even to the point of dislodging former thinking and ideas, like what Abu Bakar Bashir have just done in Indonesia, I think is a case in point. So one slide I thought worth noting, I know it's a bad slide, but how and why Islamists capture political power? It's because of one, opportunities which are provided by a particular, those in authorities, and their terrible failures, the grievances which they create one after the other, which eventually lose them popular support. And number two, the willingness of these groups to project and present themselves as the acceptable, legitimate, God-sent alternative. Basically, it's between these two how these kind of groups will emerge. And this is what happened in Algeria. This is what happened in Egypt. This is what happened in Afghanistan, even though in Afghanistan there's no ballot. Still, how the Taliban, who created such mayhem after coming to power, was still able to win such great support from the people of Afghanistan is a testimony, unfortunately, to the terrible failure of the Americans and NATO and the Karzai and the other governments in Kabul, which led to the conclusion that the Taliban is a far preferred option than what existed 20 years ago. So I think these are valuable things for us to learn. Let's not reinvent the wheel again. I mean, these points are very pointed about how these guys come to power. So the message and the point is, are we creating a fertile ground for them to enter into the hallway of power by our sheer mistake? Screaming extremists and terrorists is not going to end the game, you know. It's not. We need to do something to make the ground infertile. So, and a lot depend on us, the scholars, the academics, and most important of all, the policymakers on whom the people are going to judge. And I think therein lies important lessons for us. And I use Al-Suri in my last article for CTTA. And I think what he said is important. I mean, in Bahasa, if I may quote, you know, how he said that we groups, I mean, he's saying we is him, we are so focused on dying. We are so focused on violence. We are so focused on killing, but we lost sight of capturing power. And what we need to do is to change and look at the points in blue. And this is exactly what is happening in many parts of Southeast Asia today. They are no longer taking the AK-47 and the TND to blow up. Politics is not dirty. Politics is a necessity. We need to plan our program so that we are victorious. The future is not about martyrdom alone. It is martyrdom, but not alone. It is how to win and overcome challenges and obstacles, like what the Hamas is doing and all the other groups are doing in, say, Lebanon and elsewhere. We should sacrifice whatever is necessary so that the future generation would be in power. This is consistent. From Abu Bakar Bashir to Abu Rushdan to Paravijanto, they have not changed this. To actually, if you want to go back to Ikhwan Muslimin, Albana, he have not shifted. To Said Qutb, he have not shifted. You know, so we need both political and military power. So while we are focused on the military power, can we take our eyes on their guns, which are actually arraigned on capture of political power? The world has been socialized, according to Suri, to accepting victory to political power. And this is what our leaders should do. And finally, through the capture of political power, people's livelihood interests can be enhanced and safeguarded, and so on and so forth. I think the point I'm trying to make is that there is a shift, mindset shift in this group taking place from the Middle East all the way to here. And I think we should be mindful of this. And for us in this part of the world, there are things happening. While bullet galores continued in some parts of South Philippines, Abu Sayyaf and BIFF and what have you in some parts of southern Thailand, Myanmar, and even in Indonesia, say IS. But there is also a shift from bullets to ballots. MILF have done that in South Philippines, and there is a rising momentum in Indonesia. In 2019, Habib Rizik made a deal with a political leader that if you come to power, I want to capture, you need to give me the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Agama, Religion, and the Ministry of Communication, and 2 agencies, the headship of MUI and the chief priest or ulama in Masjid Istiqlal. So this is power, capturing of political power in terms of a long runway for them. So focus on Indonesia. Look at this, 2010 December, there is the Cianjur resolution, which none of us talk about, actually very few of us talk about it. And this was the deal after 2009, no more bombing for the time being. This resolution is still in force. And if you want to kill, go to Poso, go to Philippines, go to Middle East. In 2 more minutes, I'm going to end. IS continued, but the degradation has continued. And we need to know where they are today. In Indonesia, they exist, but they are not as significant as, say, Jamaah Islamiyah. JI to me is the most important. And the word I like to use, I'm not stealing this from Professor Kumar, but he uses this for MCP or CPM. This is exactly what is happening with regard to this group. United Front strategy to capture political, economic, religious, educational, psychological power eventually. They want to de-vaccinate the society as far as this group is concerned. This is the thinking of Abu Rushdan. This is what Abu Bakr Bashir is doing. And probably later on you'll hear Rakyan talking about the thinking of Para Vijanto. So for me, we can debate this later on. The key target is 2 years from today, the 2024 Indonesian presidential election, and for a support of an Islamist candidate. So my question is, who is the Indonesian Mosi? So there's going to be the rise of identity politics, and with debate around Islamist nationalists or nationalist Islamists. Who will win the day? I think this is something to watch as far as the trajectory is concerned. Since this is about the future and trajectory, I think this is one area as far as Indonesia. It doesn't apply in Malaysia. It's a different ballgame. But I think in Indonesia, this is what we need to watch. And if anything happens in Indonesia, I think the knock-on effect in the region will be tremendous. So in summary, all kinds of extremism exists in this part of the world. The focus has been on extremism and terrorism in general. And I think the threat came to home after Bali first, then the government have done many things and still continue to do, and terrorism remain a major issue on the security radar. But at the same time, the change has been the rise of 2 major international grouping, both with influence in this part of the world. At the same time, the terrain has become very complicated because of the splitting among them. It's no longer easy to capture one and you will capture all. It's not true. Trajectory, I think AQ remains very important in this part of the world, more important than IS. Number 2, JI remains a key group. But finally, I think we need to watch what I call the danger of As-Suriization. What As-Suri or Al-Suri is propagating, and that is the capture of politics and the defanking of these groups in order to capture political power. Of course, the big question is, if they do that, are they still terrorists or not terrorists? Well, we can talk about it. Okay, is this a means to an end, a tactic, and a strategy, or what? Ballot box is where they're going to focus a lot, especially in Indonesia. So my last slide is the threat of terrorism continues. We all know the capabilities, their capabilities have continued to grow, and they are great learners. Number 3, the linkages between local and international is very important. Look at what Al-Qaeda just said a couple of weeks ago. Far Eastern Asia, like Malaysia, Indonesia, so these are rich with recruits, ready to mobilize, highly educated, and so on and so forth. So their eyes are on this part of the world. The question is, what kind of traction is developing? The past successes of the Islamists in Algeria, Egypt, and in Afghanistan, I think something we should be mindful and careful in terms of dealing with it. And finally, I think, how do we address the problem? There's a saying in Indonesia, bunuh satu tumbuh seribu. You kill 1, 1,000 are born. So killing is not always the option. Then what else? How do you actually reach out to them and reach some kind of a modus vivendi without giving up the fundamental notion of what the state is? For example, say Pancasila. In the original which have been practiced, not the original with the seven words in it. So I think these are some of the things worth bearing in mind with Bali 20 years after the fact. I think on that note, I will stop here. Thank you, and let's listen to Rakyan after this. God bless you.
Thank you, Prof. Bilveer, for that excellent opening comments, which you have rightly pointed out that we are dealing in Southeast Asia with threat groups that are learning organizations that are able to adapt to whatever the state throws at them. Yep. Certainly, if you look at Jamaah Islamiyah, they have evolved, as you rightly say, over the past 2 decades. And in fact, one of the key points which I think is worth for us to discuss, and perhaps Pak Rakyan will also touch on this, is the lines between violent extremism and non-violent extremism and even political activity can sometimes nowadays be blurred. So with that comment and that thought, I'll pass the time now over to Pak Rakyan. Pak Rakyan, please.
Thank you so much. Let me do some sharing the screen. Okay. Let's wait a moment. Okay. Well, firstly, I would like to say thank you so much for inviting me to speak in this such a prestigious and reputable organization, the ICPVTR. Thank you so much to my friend, Professor Kumar, for inviting me. And thank you so much for the presentation from Professor Bilveer Singh for a very thorough and detailed presentations. Honestly, it's helping me a lot in explaining the topics, which I will present in the next few minutes. So I'm going to try to finish up in 20 minutes, but bear with me. Now, let's try to start by introducing what call it the PUBG, or the Panduan Umum Perjuangan Jamaah Islamiyah. This is something that already being used for generations of JI, Jamaah Islamiyah in Indonesia after they established themselves. And it's an ideological and general guidelines for the JI members to struggle and to combine the religions with the governments, ad-din and Daulah, to create a single such something similar with the caliphates or Islamic states in the step of the Prophet Khilafah. We call it the Khilafah al-Minhajin Nubuwah. Now, what is the general guideline of the JI members, the PUBG? So the founding fathers of JI described the JI ideology, which consists a set of principles. One is man is created to worship God alone, while man is also responsible to ensure the earth is managed according to the God's law. Remember, God's law. And thirdly is the man will be judged by whether his deeds are sincere toward God's and to the life of the prophets. While lastly is a man must establish a way, a life based with the unity of God, Tawhid, through Aqidah, Islamic creed, in Ibadah, worship, and the way of life, to reach the way of life. And the PUBG also described the initial organizational structure of JI, which now has totally changed from the previous era before the Parawijayanto and during Parawijayanto. Now, beside PUBG, there's also a main guidelines of JI member today. One is what called as the Total Amniyah System and Total Operational System called TASTOS. And second is strategy Tamkin, or the Tamkin strategy, a territorial strategy, which TASTOS is simply like a counterintelligence guideline on how member of the GI should behave and plan a tactical measure before and after conducting any actions or in preparing any actions until today. While the strata, strategy Tamkin, is an added versions of TASTOS. I think it's what being followed member of the member of the GI after the around 2016. I will explain in detail later on. Now, let's start from the strategy of establishing Sharia states under the general guidelines of the for GI member. So GI can be considered as a tanzim jihad and has a goal beyond nation state that to establish what so-called as Islamic governments, Khilafah Islamiyah or Daulah Islamiyah. But remember, they never interested and they never intended the Amir to be the next or to become the caliphates of these new ruling regions when they're able to establish the caliphate states. Different with ISIS, where the Amir become the caliphates. So, for example, like Prawijayanto, never going to be interested to become the caliph of the state. Instead, they are leading the way to ensure it going to be happen. Who going to lead it? They care less regarding on it. So, as a tanzim, let me try to focus on one by one in the presentations. So one is regarding of power consolidations. After the death of Abdullah Sungkar, for example, Abdullah Sungkar have a great idea in establishing a fast power consolidations in the whole regions, not just in Indonesia, but the whole Southeast Asia, as Bilveer already mentioned previously. But then it was collapsed. The idea was not disband, but there's another idea also being used in that time. Abu Rustan, for example, having a real big debates within Jamaah Islamiyah at that time, came out with the idea of not just only focusing on Askari, which is the paramilitary or operations, but also focusing on da'wah or tarbiyah. The strategy is to grab numbers of supporters or big number of supporters, because he perceived the Askari tactics or strategies is so dangerous for the organizations. So and the da'wah tactics, the da'wah strategy, the tarbiyah strategy is successfully bringing a huge number of followers across Indonesia. Now, according to, for example, the Detachment 88, saying that the numbers of GI is around 6,000, 7,000 members all across Indonesia. And it's confirmed by, according to Budi Trikaryanto, for example, one of the GI top leaders who was arrested. He mentioned until 2019 the numbers of GI, registered GI in Indonesia is around 600. Now, also during Prawijayanto, there's an establishment of what called as Sasana. Sasana is like a training ground. And the establishment of Sasana is aimed to build power. For example, like Sasana Satria Muda in Ungaran in Central Java, or Sasana Satria Muda in city of Ambarawa, and also in Central Java. There are only around like 6 people for each batch during the Sasana that being sent to Syria, while big number of the people, for example, sometimes around like 11, sometimes 16. In the last batch, for example, called the Sasana Satria Mas Purwodadi. In Purwodadi is one of another city in Central Java. And Magelang had around like 50 members. But only 32, around 35 of them who passed and sent to Syria. So until today, until Prawijayanto arrested, the numbers of Sasana that has been established and batches already created is around like 7 batches. And it's successfully recruiting huge number of followers as well. Now, Second is the istinsaf. Istinsaf is a propaganda, is a what do you call it? Is a psychological warfare. How to do it? They attack coincidence, creating a narrative, criticizing the government, so through social media, through demonstrations, inciting demonstrations, the hate against the governments, also to lose the faith and to lose the trust to the governments. So it will urge the implementation of Sharia law. This is the strategy that people currently doing right now in GI, and it's also part of the implementation of the Tamkin strategy, which I will discuss later on. Now, GI incorporated with the political elements as a part of the strategy. It's not just only attack, the Amalia, for example, but also incorporated with political elements. One of them, for example, joining or creating, inciting in hashtags, for example. This is something that quite known by the younger generations, creating a hashtag. For example, like after the arrest of An-Najah and Okbah, two of the prominent members of the GI, the Neo-GI, they created hashtags online in social media called the Bebaskan Ulama or Free the Ulama, while, for example, at the same time creating a hashtag called Bubarkan Densus 88, disband Attachment 88, the anti-terrorism units under the police. So this is part of the GI strategy. Now, thirdly is regarding on the, let me move to the small Amalia or small actions. So GI avoid bombing activities that may harm people in regard to whether it's a Muslim or police, armed force, and civilians, but doesn't mean that they don't have the capability on doing that, because as Pa Bilveer said in his presentations, the ICDAT, the preparation is keep doing it until today. So they are preparing themselves for any kind of scenario. One of them is the Amalia. Now, chaos management. This is very important things. When chaos happens, GI has prepared sufficient strategies to get the support from the Muslims by providing, for example, logistical supplies, food, money, whatever you need, they can provide to you, as to enhance the chaos within certain regions or certain province, for example, in Indonesia. GI can take the right step in taking advantages during the chaos. For example, like if you remember the chaos or the riots happened during the 212, it's 2 December. The GI took the time and consider whether the momentum will create a big chaos or not. So they will enter this kind of strategies by bandwagoning or bandwagoning any potential conflicts which in relation with religion. So this is something that we will talk later on regarding on the political identity things during during 2023 and 2024. Now, number 5 is uniting small groups. Uniting small groups is a way have a similar goals. For example, like reorganizing and creating a great network between countries, from Indonesia to Philippines, to Thailand, to any other countries outside, like in the Middle East. It's something that's still being managed. One of them that have the authority in doing that is the son of Parawijayanto, Askari Sephatul Haq, that being appointed during Parawijayanto as a international relations head of the GI. Now, lastly is the implementation of the Sharia law or Islamic Sharia declarations. Now, one thing that you need to understand, in Indonesian context, for example, with the rise of conservatisms currently happening in Indonesia in the last decades, it's much more let's put it this way. If ISIS and GI is a company and they need to sell something, GI, the product that GI has, the product that GI sell is the implementation of Sharia law. While the ISIS, as a company, they provide the product that they're selling is the establishment of caliphate systems. Now, from those two companies, which products that will be sellable, much more easier to be sellable in Indonesia? Certainly the GI. The implementation of Sharia law is much more likable and sellable in the Indonesian context, especially during the rise of conservatisms. Now, let's go to the TASTOS. The TASTOS is a counterintelligence guideline. So you have PUBG as a general guidelines. You have a more strategized and implementations, a strategy, a guideline for the strategy within the fields, in the fields, and that's TASTOS. There's a couple of things that being mentioned in TASTOS, but the idea is to ensure the safety of individuals. That's the principle of AMNIA, or the protections, safety. Now, so one of them, let's do one by one. Communications. Communication. GI member is being prohibited to use the new generation of GI gadget, the 4G, especially the 5G, but they are not allowed to use that kind of things. Some of them are still using it as part of the easier ways to communications, but for them who understand security, they're never going to use those kind of generation of gadgets. Instead, they use the old gadgets, the old cell phones that not requiring anti-tracking. They doesn't have any there's only 2G phones, especially who doesn't connect with. They just only connect with the GPRS or 2G, but not using any tracking devices which connected with Google. That's one of the ways. So, and then they're never going to speak out in regards to the terms. For example, if they are talking about guns, instead of using the words of guns or buying guns, they will say, "I would like to buy a corn," for example. That's one of the ways disguising into special words. Now, the member also should know when and how to change the SIM cards, and they will keep changing SIM card in Indonesia, especially like in Indonesia right now. It's easy to find the idea of someone else and to put them into their own and to register the SIM card. We need to register the SIM card, but it's easy to find. Unfortunately, it's easy to find other people national ID cards and use that as a way to register SIM card. So, and when a member being arrested, certainly the important thing is to cut the chain relations between one and another. So, for example, like the arrest of Agus Suparnoto, for example, when his house was under surveillance, everyone is needed to go out and find another place to live, and so they move from one place to another place. Now, 4 is the wild card, or we call it the Keller. Keller is this is not English term. This is a Javanese terms. The idea is if you find someone that is being used by the police or perceived to be having a relation with the police or under surveillance of the police, but not being arrested immediately. So what the GI do is they will dismiss the person from the GI structure activities. They will certainly not going to involve them with any kind of programs or activities, And the persons who knows that being left behind need to move to other regions to ensure the safety of their own brothers and sisters. Now, number 5 is stalking. Now, so this is there has a 3 implementation of stalkings. 1, stalkings to potential new recruiters. This is same way with the strategy of the NII, Negara Islam Indonesia, in the past. They stalk individuals to see whether they have the really connections with intelligence, Indonesian intelligence, with police or military. And second is to keep a personal maknawiyat. This is the nature of avoiding the harmful thought of ideology. So for example, like there's one guy called Jamaluddin. He's the senior member and former Qaid division leader, and also the head of the FKPP, Forum of Pesantren Educations, who refused to answer Parawijayanto's calling as the Amir of JI, even though Parawijayanto never how to say this, never asked anyone else to call him, you must call me as an Amir, but it's already within the circle of the Jamaah Islamiyah to always convey that addressing your leader as a Amir. Now, Jamaluddin changed his mindset, and he never want to consider, never want to call Parawijayanto as an Amir. So what he do is the JI is removed him, dismiss him from JI membership, but never label him as a kafir. Now, and then lastly, so there's 3, right? So lastly is stalking to the candidates or members of wife. So for example, you have a member and you want to have a wife, the Jamaah Islamiyah, the organization, will do it for you to find you the right woman and to stalk him, to do surveillance whether it's going to safe or not safe for the organizations. So this is conducted by each division leader of the Qaid. Now, the concept of Keller itself is if someone that have a status of Keller or being known or detected by the police, certainly the part of the strategy is trying to minimize the role of him. Now, number 7, no. Let's talk about the escape, the anticipations of the important documents. So in order to be able to escape without harming the organizations, all documents need to be protected, need to be burned after being used, for example. If it's in cell phones or in computer, must under at least in the password, even though, you know, this is at least what they can do, because in today's systems, there's a way how to hack into and open a password, a document saved with password. But having a password is one of the important strategies, important way that need to be learned, need to be done by the JI. Lastly, the incognito is to anticipate being detected from one's appearance. So later on, I will show you a picture of Parawijayanto, because apparently human is always a human. So sometimes you make mistakes. So in part of incognito is to disguise appearance. So you're never going to see a GI member, especially a prominent GI member, wearing a garment or clothing that very look alike with the Ikhwan, you know, the long garments, not touching for example, not touching the what do you call it, the ankles, for example. They are allowed to wear, for example, jeans. They allowed to be coloring their hairs, and even if it must, they are able and they are allowed to smoke, because no Ikhwan doing smokings. But they're allowed to do this kind of things as part of the disguising to save their positions. This is the Paravijayanto. As you see, the appearance is I don't know, maybe this is one of the things. You've led the organization for nearly 9 years. Human is humans. His one of his latest position, for example, he was working as a human resource head in one of the prominent private companies based in Kudus, and he got good money from it. Now, but again, people is people. He changed his appearance. There's a black mark on the foreheads, which honestly under the Tastos is not being. But again, now I want to talk about Tamkin. I have around like 5-6 minutes or so. So Tamkin is another strategy. So they change this, they adapt. GI is a very adaptive organizations. They adapt with the current situations. Now the Tamkin strategy or the territorial strategy is an updated guidelines as a complement of the Tastos. I think it's created around like 2016, and it's a way to piggyback the 212 movements, which currently at that time was called the Assoc case. Assoc is one of the Assoc is the governors of Jakarta, the previous governors of Jakarta before Anies Baswedan. That was there's a big demonstration against him called the 212 movements, and they are piggyback the movements, as I mentioned previously. So they systematically shift their focus from a violent hard approach activities to more covert sort approach activities. As I mentioned, selling an idea of the implementation of Sharia law is much more easier instead on asking people to join or creating a caliphate system and totally disbanding the Pancasila or the Indonesian democracy systems. The main goal of this group is to gain political legitimacy and enough public support to in order to extend the support within the community or within the society. Now, this is the Tamkin strategy. I will try to do it as fast as possible. The Alwi and Tahjiz program, sending members to Syria, establishing Sasana, the Kital Karib, for example, the training of the Tolabul Iwa wal Nusratairi. So Alwi is intelligence divisions, prepare members of the Askari, the military programs, establishing Sasana, the 7th batch between 2010, perhaps 2017, the implementation of Sasana, including preparation or contribution of Sharia. So as I mentioned, the people that being trained in Sasana is not for conducting terror activities within the countries, but instead to be sent abroad as part of the networking, helping, and so on and so forth. So that's one, and there is numbers of people that being sent in Syria during the conflicts. Second is regarding on the Da'wah programs. So Da'wah program is based on Tamhiz, which is the HR departments, the Taklim, which is the teaching, and the Taklim or Tarbiyah is the teachings, and Tablik, which is the preaching. So that's there's a couple of phases of Da'wah that being used from Sharia Da'wah, the secret Da'wah. Can be done secretly to certain people that already being known each other, because it's talking about the GI strategy, so on and so forth. Second is Jawar Da'wah. Jawar is when done a little bit openly, but disclosed regarding on Jamaah Islamiyah organizations, because there's Tanzim Syria organizations. Lastly is the Iqamatu Daulah Islamiyah. Whereas as a transition era of the Daulah Islamiyah start forming, the Dawah can be done openly. Now, next is regarding on the FKPP program. Number 3 is establishing Pesantren Islamic School. GI currently having like more or less 8 main Pesantrens, but it's not owned by them. It's influenced by the members of GI. by controlling the structures of organizations, so on and so forth. Yes, there is a couple of what call it pesantren that indeed being established and being made by JI member directly. Now I think my time is a bit up. So let's sorry. So the development of FKPPF divisions is to gain numbers of supporters within the groups. Now let's go to Tarbiyah program. It's the same way with the last one. It's a way to get supporters from within the communities through the Tarbiyah. It's using the same concept with the Murabi. You know, the Murabi is one of the guide, the leader of the small groups who doing the Tarbiyah. Now, economy and Akib, for example. If you remember, GI member have the capability in creating a business. So this business model is one of the way of entrepreneurship trainings, one of the way of entrepreneurships that give the ability of financially sustainability of within an organization. That's why, for example, they have businesses. For example, like they have, for example, what do you call it? A plantation, for example, is one of the ways on having entrepreneurships. And Nakib, lastly, is regarding on the network building programs. During the 210, the GI actively built a connection within the elements. I'm not talking about sending people abroad. I'm talking about creating network within. So that's why they have a network to FBI, for example, to certain parties. The parties are that being infiltrated by OTBA. This is not the decision of the organizations, but this is the decisions of the OTBA itself to join one of the new established party, including, for example, Zain Anaja, who successfully joining the Ulama Council of Indonesia in the past, then was apprehended by the police. This is one of the way they will infiltrate many legitimate organizations as a way to spread their narrative, to influence narrative and to influence the policymaker. Now, this is the structure of the GI in the past. You can see, for example, there are two sides, the Kodima, based on the Kodima, East and West, and so forth. But again, this is something that now I can easily say this is already like disbanded or not being used after the arrest of Parawijayanto. They're totally like disbanding. So do not use this kind of structure to explain what currently happening in the GI. Now, for the conclusions, GI able to evolve. The GI able to evolve in any kind of situations, and they will keep evolving. So, if you compare the ISIS affiliates in Indonesia, the JID, compare with the GI, the JID in Indonesia, I can consider themselves as a bunch of Boy Scouts, a bunch of amateurs comparing with GI, who have a better structure, a better strategies within the organizations. And the current GI roles, current GI goals, for example, is getting legitimacy, currently getting legitimacy and support within the community, especially the conservative groups within Indonesia, and gathering resource to prepare when the time for return to more feasible activities, for example, violence is needed, but not now. They are not going to do any terror attacks in time being. But again, if they are not doing any terrorism activities, can we consider them a threat or not? This is something that we can discuss later on. So GI stealth organization activities, including infiltration, as I mentioned, joining political parties is now allowed. Joining like MUI in the time by Anaja, for example, it can be done. So what I'm what I need to underline here is the government has yet regularly review and update the counterterrorism regulations, because this kind of groups will keep changing tactics. Now, lastly, the counterterrorism aim must be marginalized. To marginalize the militants and the promotes efforts in isolate and reduce the extremists. So they need the numbers of people that will join any radical organization will be keep growing and growing. So you need to maintain the numbers, you need to press down, and you need to isolate the capability of them recruiting more peoples. Therefore, for example, the policy on empowering moderates is very important. It's a head-to-head thing, honestly. The moderate is the one that, honestly, the numbers of moderates in Indonesia, I think, are going to be more than 90% comparing the numbers of the radical radical groups. But again, if it's going to be a silent majority, there's nothing. There is no way the Indonesian will able to press down and to isolate the numbers of radicals. So speak up. So the moderates need to be speaking up and need to be supported by the governments. Now, Muslim Indonesia need to be encouraged to resolve their differences democratically. This is something that I need to underline also. The use of political identity in 2023 suddenly going to be used. When it being used by political party or politicians, I will ensure you it will be the GI movements will piggyback. The GI movement will bandwagoning your strategies in order to convey their message. So do not use political identity just to win the election, for example. So lastly, Muslim organization must make awareness that extremist infiltration is real and dangerous. It's happening and it's still happening until today. The possibility they recruits people within state-owned companies or government institution is still big. So a clear internal procedures must be created for early detections, isolation, and handling of extremists. I'm sorry taking so long of my time, Professor Kumar, but that's the end of my presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Rakyan, and thanks again to both Prof. Bilveer and Pak Rakyan for their very comprehensive remarks, which in many ways very complementary to one another. I think to get the ball rolling, and I'm happy to see some of the questions coming in, I guess to set the scene for discussion, it seems to me that based on both of your remarks, JI has evolved under the pressure from security forces from being a more outright terrorist organization to something more subtle. It seems to be that JI has, especially since 2009, under the leadership of Para Vijayanto, become more focused on developing into extremist organization that operates in the shadows, right? And I think one thing which Pak Rakyan mentioned at the end of his, towards the end of his presentation, which I think is quite significant, is the idea that the strategy of infiltration of society seems to be quite a significant move by GI now. And as Prof. Bilveer mentioned, this is reminiscent of the old United Front tactics of the Communist Party of Malaya. So that's very interesting. So I wonder whether or not both of you would want to comment on this, and how do you see this trend of infiltration of society developing, and what do you think should be done by the relevant authorities in Indonesia? Maybe Bilveer, you go first, and then Pak Rakyan.
Yeah, thank you, Kumar, and thank you, actually, Pak Rakyan, for that excellent presentation. I still think he has just given us the tip of the iceberg. I think he knows much more, and I think we should dig as much out from him, because he have dealt specifically with each of these elements. But Prof. Kumar, with regard to your question, I think I go back to my earlier point that extremist and terrorist organizations are actually great learners. They learn from the domestic environment, they learn from the regional environment, and I think they learn from the international environment. So far, with regard to so-called extremist radical group, which are framed by the state, and how groups have come back to capture power, be it in Algeria for a short while, the FIS, be it the Ikhwan Muslimin in Egypt. And then I think the Taliban case is slightly different. I think the moral of the story is they know what they are facing against at home and abroad, and then they know how to design their acceptance in one way or another, and that's how they come into power. And they come to power primarily, they will try not through guns but through the ballot box. And the key strategy is one, delegitimizing the other. I think which Rakyan talked about the propaganda and the psychological strategy in Tashtosh in particular. Number two, by gaining greater acceptance. Today in the Indonesian elections, we talk about electibilitas, acceptability in elections. In the case of this group, their acceptance stem from the fact that one, this does not apply to Muslim minority states. This is Muslim majority states. That we are in a Muslim majority state. The context is 90% of the population. Number three, we accept modernity. There is a way of syncing Islam and modernity. And number four, there has in fact been a great compact. Of course, there is not absolute truth here, but compact. And the compact is being used, for example, by Abu Bakr Bashir at the moment. I support Pancasila. But when you push him further, I support the first Pancasila and not the second Pancasila. There are two Pancasila, right? The first one have the 7 words about essentially which involve like the Jakarta Charter. So their ability to play this is how the infiltration comes in. But I think the moral of the story, and for me, is this. Why would Indonesian wants to buy this argument and this scenario and this? And the reason would be there are enough elements, not a majority yet, but enough who are unhappy because of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 issues. And their ability to piggyback in terms of creating issues, credibility, legitimacy issue is how they came in board. I mean, I was in Jakarta during the Ahok riots, and I saw how the JI operated. My friends in the JI were doing it. I went to their warehouse, and there were 10,000 singlets, and God knows how much money they had. And eventually, they came up with a book about why we should bring Ahok down because of Penistaan Agama. I mean, amazing. They were the best propagandists as far as this issue was concerned. So their ability to take advantage of existing situation, I think, is the key element. Number two, my concern is this. Their ability actually to not just infiltrate, but successfully infiltrate at different levels of society. Capturing the universities and student movements. Today, if you go to Jakarta, ask Pak Ryan, I just came back. I mean, you raise 30% of petrol prices and look at the demonstrations. I think next week is going to be the mega one, right? Or the 4th of October. And these guys are going to take advantage of that in one form or another. And this is heading towards 23, 24. So their ability to take advantage, not because they really believe in it, but they believe in the ultimate objective, where they want to go. And this is where I see a Morsi, where I see what happened in the with the FIS, and so on and so forth. What am I watching for? I'm watching for a compromise from the government with them.
I see.
That's what I'm watching for. I'm watching for that. And for some people, Jokowi's success in compromising with Prabowo was actually one of his greatest political achievements. Why? Because he actually undercut the extremists. If he had not, and if the violence had continued, only God knows what would have happened after the demonstration before the presidential sworn in his cabinet. But by doing that, he succeeded. The president, Megawati, I think Pak Tito and the intelligence community succeeded in taking Prabowo out. Of course, the extremists or whatever you want to call them thought Prabowo sudah masuk kandang of the presidency. But it was the other way around. So today, the greatest loss the left, or not the left here, the Islamists have suffered is that Prabowo is no longer identified in terms of political identity with them. They are looking for someone else. So the achievement of Pak Jokowi and his group was to remove Prabowo from this group and eventually be where he is. Now, will he flip-flop towards them? I don't think so.
Prof, Bilveer, sorry, because we have time, I want to give Pak Rakyan a
Fine. No,
chance.
I'm going to end that, and I said this is something where Pak Ryan actually can talk a lot about.
Okay. Pak Rakyan, maybe you can briefly comment on this.
Yes, certainly. One of the key things that I want to underline after what Pak Bilveer said. Well, Prabowo is always a nationalist, but political identity is political identity. Numbers of countries, not just only Indonesia, numbers of countries, for example, like India, US, they are also using a political identity as a way to grab a number of hardliner followers in order to win the elections. As simple as that. But suddenly we don't need, I'm hoping so much Indonesia not going to do that low. The politician in Indonesia not doing that low in just only trying to win the election in 2024, because the impact will be devastating. It is so certain the radicals, especially the GI, will piggyback a political identity that being used in by the politicians. So one way or another, it will support. It's giving advantages with the both parties. The politicians will having a good benefits if it's being supported by conservatives, while the conservatives in Indonesia is fully is being supported also by those groups, because those are the hardliner part. Those are the hardliner who going to see everything in black and white. So when they see everything in black and white and supporting one, for example, let me get this in the most easiest way. A woman becoming the imam. A woman is being supported by parties to be the next presidents in Indonesia. Let's just say something like that. It's very certain the narrative that's going to be used by the radical movements and by politicians as well, supported by politicians and backed by the radical movements. For example, only male that giving the rights under Islam to become an imam. One of the most easiest way. So both the radical groups and the politician will keep using this narrative.
Yep.
Only male that's supposed to be an imam, so on and so forth, that we can use. And certainly, if the conservative groups were heading toward the same directions with the goals that created by the politician using the political identity, suddenly a woman never going to able to lead this country, a very democratic society with its in Indonesia, just because of religious reasons. But the impact will be devastating, because the radicals who piggyback with the narrative that created by the politicians, they will suddenly put under the spell of numbers of by a lot of peoples, that the impact will be so devastating. It will influence the people not going to accept any woman to lead any kind of roles in Indonesia.
That's right.
And who going to get most advantages from that? The radicals. There will be no camat, a woman as a camat, a woman as a government official, so on and so forth, just because they have already planted into their narrative within their mindsets after the long political identity campaign created between 2023 2024. It creates a narrative as if woman is never to be allowed to lead any.
This is what you are saying, the quest for control of the dominant narratives in society, which is something which both of you actually pointed out. From the questions, right, one of the key element that comes out is a big question. Some would say the $64,000 question. So many people say that IS is the big threat in Indonesia and the region. But based on what you're saying, both of you, it seems that actually we should rethink this. Perhaps JI is the bigger threat than IS. What do you think? Both of you? Maybe
Very quickly, I will say I've always maintained JI is a bigger threat than IS, but it doesn't mean we close our eyes to IS, because I think IS still have traction. But because of the long-standing context presence of JI, which you go back to DI, NEE, and all the way, so the long history. I mean, if Taliban have Pashtun Wali, we have JI Wali. If you want to understand it, I mean, that's the point I'm trying to make. I mean, this is exactly what Abu Rushdar talks about. He said, because of the history, because of the ideology, because of the culture, all those things, JI will never die, because we see ourselves totally differently, regardless of what you think. IS is very different. I agree with Pak Rakyan. IS really Boy Scout levels, and they will never reach the same level. I think they are able to carry out 1-2 operations. Look at the operation in Jakarta. I think it speaks volume. But that doesn't mean we close our eyes to them. I don't think so, because a couple of options are possible. Okay, one, better leaders will come in. Number two, won't make you so sure. I mean, I've been always raising this, that elements of JI who are unhappy with JI may move towards them, or even vice versa. But I think both are equally dangerous. It's not a question of either or, but one is far more potent than the other for a whole host of reasons. And therefore, we should be more JI-centric, AQ-centric than IS-centric. I think that's the reality on the ground.
Okay. Pak Ryan.
Yeah, certainly you cannot compare apple with durian, for example, because for me the two organizations having or implementing a different kind of strategies. It goes the other way around. It doesn't end to the same directions. Yeah. People think it's same directions, but it's not. The implementation of Sharia law is much more, as I mentioned a couple of times ago, it's much more easier to find followers on that. Who going to reject it?
When you say implementation Sharia law, do you mean creating an Islamic state, or is it the same thing to you?
Not directly, because the Sharia law can be implemented with any kind of system. Caliphate is one of the systems. For example, like in Brunei Darussalam or in Saudi Arabia, also using Sharia law as a base of the law. So it doesn't need to always to be so segmented on caliphate systems, which being promoted by ISIS, if I may say promoted. But for GI, they see the process. They willing to accept the long process that need to be run by them, and in those long process, their aim, when if the Islamic law is being implemented in the region or in Indonesia, for example, a step by step to make people understand the importance on disbanding the human-made law into the God's law system. It's a win. It's going to be a clear win for them. They care less regarding on who going to lead the country or who going to lead the regions as the Amir or as the leader or as the presidents, because the idea is having a great foundations which based on Islamic law. If it's Islamic law running, it means Islamic states.
Good point. One of the key important points I thought was brought out during this presentation is the role of JI interest in regional cooperation. For example, Pak Ryan, you mentioned that JI, part of its strategy of Tamkin also involves reaching out to similar groups in the region. Like this reminds me of 20 years ago, there was, remember this Rabitatu Mujahideen group. So do you think that is JI still interested in this, or are they focused on creating Islamic State Indonesia as the priority? So perhaps Pak Rakyan first, then Bilveer.
Okay. Well, certainly Prawijayanto, well, not disbanding the idea on focusing on regions, but he is now focusing more on Indonesian context. That's why there is no such thing as the region systems in the past which being used in the in previous GI systems, which consists on Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, what call it, southern part of Philippines, including some part of Australia. It's being left behind because they are prioritizing Indonesia. As Pak Bilveer Singh said previously, whatever happens in Indonesia, the impact the impact will be so devastating with the whole regions. Professor Kumar, we are Southeast Asia is one of the biggest region in the world who has the biggest populations, Islamic populations.
That's right.
Not Middle East.
That's
but
right.
there's but it's less problem like Middle East. So if you want to find a bigger follower on certain topics, certain things, for example, like the implementation of Sharia law, much more easier to find in Southeast Asia compared in Middle East, because the number of the consumer, if I may say, is much more bigger than in Middle East. Now, if it's happened, certainly, but what happened in Indonesia will give impact to any part of the region as well, whether it's just only as simple like, oh, they can do it, then I must do it the same thing, or from the security perspective, where a big riots, like if you remember, Pak Bilveer, when the 98 riots happened in Jakarta, how many Indonesians moved to Singapore?
Yeah,
so huge, so huge. It create inflation within the country, because there are so many Indonesian bringing monies there, cash. So anything happen within the Indonesians, the impact will be so devastating.
Because of time, may I ask Prof. Bilveer, one of the questions I think is important is, okay, based on what we know about the evolving threat situation, one of the questions is, so, what can our security forces and agencies do to keep up with these quickly evolving threat organizations? What can the governments and security forces do? I mean, Bilveer, you want to come in with this?
I think very quickly, I think the entire presentation by Rakyan and me today has been to map out what is changing on the ground. So in order to be able to keep up and in fact be ahead of them, I think we need to understand how these groups have changed their narrative. I mean, task force and Tamkin and all these are vital things about how they look at the world today and what they are doing to actualize their goals. And it's not just the bombing, it's much more than that. This is a much more difficult part to comprehend, because you need the language, you need to understand the culture, you even need to understand the religion, you need to understand the interconnectedness within and without. And sometimes this is something, capacities which we do not have. I think we need to put a lot of resources, a lot of manpower, experts, specialists, area specialists into this, so that we can keep up with the trends, in the sense that this is a moving target. A moving target cannot be understood just in terms of the past, but we need to follow this and then reach conclusion about what to do. I think that's one of the most important things. It's not just intelligence, it's much more than that. Intelligence is useful, but I think keeping up with the trend, knowing what they are talking and thinking about, the fact that many of the time they're talking in coded language, which we may not apprehend or comprehend. So I think this is, to me, the biggest challenge facing all of us. And for this, my urge is the intel community, the policy community, and the analyst community need to work together. Otherwise, I tell you, we're going to walk and talk across each other, and we are going to be all losers, because this guy is going to march forward as the winners. I mean, we know what GI did in the last 20 years, and we've been talking about it, and yet we keep talking about IS being a major one. I mean, it beats me. I mean, I am flabbergasted. How can you talk about that when you know, and you even use JI to counter IS, and you give legitimacy to JI all these years? So it's interesting. So my point is, know your enemy, know your friend, 100 battle, 100 victory. So we need to understand them and drill down about what is in their mind and what is in the heart and what they're doing.
There's a quotation from Sun Tzu, right? Pak Rakyan, final comment from you.
But certainly, GI is a very evolving organization. They're able to adapt with any kind of harsh environments. And right now, they still adapt.
Yep.
even though the rest of Paravijayanto and many other people try to focus on one thing. For example, the son of Paravijayanto, which is Askari Sirfatul Haq, still at large right now, and he's one of the prominent member, and he's also marrying. So he's also marrying a daughters of an ex Amir, a previous Amir. So it's a royal wedding. So certainly it's he has the full authority, if I may say, full authority to lead up the organizations in the future. But again, as I said previously, but we are dealing with a situation where there was a time in the past, not long ago, we are so focused on ISIS. All people in Southeast Asia are so focusing on ISIS. We forgot that we still have an enemy that it's badly wounded, but it's not dead yet, which is the JI. And they're using the opportunity, they're using the momentum, because everyone is so focusing on with the ISIS in the Middle East and so forth. They care less about JI and perceived that JI is less important than ISIS. Everyone talk about ISIS, so let's talk about ISIS. Let's stop doing this. Yep. It's a lesson learned from us that looks what happened later on. It's not emergence of GI. They always there. We are the one that shifting our mindset to something else. So don't do this kind of things again, because when another organization appear, then we go to focus on the new organization and forgot the others. No, those are real threats, whether it's ISIS, whether it's JI. The JID is not dead yet. The narrative is still being used at large in social media, especially also in Telegram and many others. We have a teams that monitoring the social medias that suddenly pop up in the narrative. For example, pickups. There's numbers of Indonesian also involved with the discussions of the with the AQ in what call it in India, for example, after big riots of political identity being used there against the Muslims. So everywhere. So let's try to keep up against them that always evolve in order to make sure that Indonesia and the whole regions is still safe. That's part of the last thing from me, Pa. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We've had a very rich session with both Prof. Bilveer and Pak Rakyan, and as expected, we have had a very good start to our webinar series. And I think the big takeaway from both of you this morning is that we should never make the mistake of underestimating JI. As been pointed out, JI is down but not out. And although the focus has fairly been on IS during the past recent years, JI has a longer term game plan, and they are evolving to achieve this great game plan. So it is important and prudent of us to keep our eye on JI as well. So this is a great way to bring our discussion to a close. So thanks, Prof. Bilveer and Pak Rakyan, for sharing your insights with us. And I look forward to engaging with you going in the future, not too long from now, either here or in Jakarta, with Pak Rakyan. So
I look forward, Pa.
And colleagues, I just want to draw your attention to the second webinar, which is being planned for our series. The link is there, so please take note. So that will be soon. And of course, please take a look at ICPVTR Southeast Asia Militant Atlas, which is interactive map which provides a consolidated visual database of ISIS and JI terrorist incidents in Southeast Asia. So all this is on the website. So with that, it just leaves me to thank our speakers and to thank all of you for your attention and for your questions. Apologize if I couldn't get all of them, but I tried to summarize the bulk of them. So with that, thank you very much, and see you all at our next webinar.